Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the first virtual session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum, Advancing Cyber Defense and Resilience in the Age of Strategic Competition. Held with support from the US Embassy in Tokyo, the US-Japan Cyber Forum is a three-part webinar series focusing on three interdependent themes that underpin US-Japan cyber cooperation: defense, diplomacy, and development. Our current project builds on the successful outcomes of Pacific Forum's US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation beyond the Tokyo 2020 Olympics held in August 2021. The event was held with the generous support from the Consulate General of Japan here in Honolulu and Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The virtual workshop, which convened American, Japanese, and regional cybersecurity experts and practitioners, examined the entire gamut of US-Japan cyber cooperation. That includes critical national infrastructure, ransomware attacks, supply chain resilience, submarine cables, even the disruptive effects of critical technologies like artificial intelligence. The Tokyo Olympics was not just a major sporting event, it was a critical turning point in Japanese cybersecurity policy. Despite the unprecedented challenges of mounting the historic event, it pushed cybersecurity as an important pillar to Japan's defense and security policy. The Tokyo Olympics 2020 showcased in an interesting fashion, especially to the general public, why we should care about cybersecurity. In organizing our online event in 2021, we also conducted a tabletop exercise which simulated a hypothetical major cyber attack surrounding the Olympics. Through productive exchanges during our plenary sessions and the cybersecurity tabletop exercise, the final output of the project that is shared through the chat underscored the following policy recommendations. First, include greater provision of technical and policy coordination between the US and Japan on critical national infrastructure protection. Second, upgrade the current level of information sharing mechanisms between public and commercial entities. Third, intensify joint efforts in public attribution of major cyber attacks while maintaining support for cyber norms and international law. Fourth, increase investments to Japan's cybersecurity capabilities at the technical, organizational, and tactical level. And the last one, explore the implications of artificial intelligence as a force multiplier of cybersecurity defense and offensive capabilities. Building on the US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation beyond the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, our latest endeavor, the US-Japan Cyber Forum, aims to evaluate the current tempo of cooperation between the two allies given the drastic changes in the international environment. Recognizing that the cyber landscape has become more unstable and fragile in the new normal, we seek to analyze how recent geopolitical and technological challenges impact the US-Japan alliance from a cybersecurity perspective. To further set the scene for the overall direction of our latest project, I would like to call on Dr. Crystal Pryor, Director of Research at the Pacific Forum. Crystal, please.
Thank you, Mark. Aloha and Ohayo gozaimasu from Tokyo. Pacific Forum International is proud to partner once again with the US Embassy Tokyo on our latest cybersecurity and critical technology endeavor, the US-Japan Cyber Forum, Defense, Diplomacy, and Development. This project comes at the heels of much intense debate on Japan's pursuit of active cyber defense, which reflects Tokyo's shifting policy outlook regarding the need for more proactive cyber measures amid evolving cybersecurity threat landscape driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sustained Chinese-linked cyber operations, and other concerning cyber activities. Japan's recent stream of defense and security documents released late last year point to an increasing appetite towards cyber capacity building, and Japan's bureaucratic restructuring to address the urgency of various cyber challenges stemming from the geopolitical and technological disruptions we're seeing. Japan's possible shift to active cyber defense is a positive development from the perspective of the United States, as it would allow the self-defense forces to more effectively contribute to joint cyber operations and thwarting cyber attacks. Over the past 4 years, the US cyber strategy has moved beyond the conventional notion of deterrence to adopt a new paradigm called persistent engagement that will allow the US to counter cybersecurity threats in the gray zone. The Biden administration is also in the process of finalizing the US national cybersecurity strategy. The document is expected to go beyond information sharing and public-private partnership to emphasize mandatory regulations. Such sweeping changes will help transition traditional public-private partnerships to public-private operational collaboration. Although it's still far too early to assume that Japan would possibly adopt a more offensive posture in the cyber arena, active cyber defense could allow both allies to work more collaboratively in implementing responsive and proactive cybersecurity countermeasures against malicious cyber attacks, including disinformation campaigns from foreign adversaries. However, the challenge is, how will such changes impact the regulatory aspects of the cybersecurity landscape, especially from the viewpoint of the private sector, who has operational oversight over domains including critical national infrastructure? We hope that the US-Japan Cyber Forum will help clarify these challenges and uncover opportunities for greater cyber policy coordination between DC and Tokyo. Once again, welcome to all of our participants tuning in here in Japan, the US, other parts of the region for our newest series on cybersecurity. Hopefully you'll join us not only for today's webinar on cyber defense, but also throughout this entire series, which includes diplomacy and development as well. Aloha, and thank you very much. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Crystal, for kicking us off and joining us live from Tokyo. And there is indeed a ground to cover and unpack given the dramatic changes and policy shift in US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation over the past year alone. But before we jump into our discussion today, allow me to share some housekeeping rules. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video audio recording of the session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. This session will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participant cameras are disabled throughout the session. However, during our Q&A discussion, participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Note that participants, you may submit your questions in the Q&A box as you have them during the presentations. We will also have interactive features like polling as we go along. We ask that everyone answer this poll question to warm up our discussion. Our poll for today is, how can the government and the private sector improve trust and transparency on information sharing? While we're waiting on those poll results, I'll note that we also have a survey we would like you all to complete after the event concludes. Please find the link to the post-event survey in the chat box now. So again, the question is, how can the government and the private sector improve trust and transparency on information sharing? We have a tie, provide incentives, get 47%, conduct regular roundtables or meetings at 47%. In second is impose mandatory incident reporting at 37%. And last would be encourage self-regulation at 32%. Let's see how the poll results changes throughout the discussion. And now on today's session, for this first session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum, allow me to introduce our three renowned experts. Our first panelist will be Dr. Emily Goldman from the Strategist at the US Cyber Command. Second is Koichiro Komiyama, Director of Global Coordination Division at JP CERT-C. And lastly, Michael Karimian, Director of Digital Diplomacy, Asia Pacific at Microsoft. Our first panelist will be Dr. Emily Goldman. Dr. Goldman serves as a strategist at US Cyber Command and was cyber advisor to the Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State from 2018 to 2019. She also directed the National Security Agency Combined Action Group, worked as a strategic communications advisor for US Central Command and for the coordinator on counterterrorism at the State Department. As a professor of political science at the University of California, Davis, she published and lectured widely on strategy, cybersecurity, arms control, military history and innovation, and organizational change. Dr. Goldman, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Crystal. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the Pacific Forum and the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo for hosting this event. Before I get started, I just want to make a disclaimer that the comments I'm going to make represent my own views and are not necessarily the official position of any U.S. government agency. I'm really excited to be here to talk about the US-Japan defense relationship and the different strategic approaches that we've been innovating and sharing together. So we were, for the audience, we were given a series of questions, each of us different questions that I think Mark put together. And so I'm going to try to key off of some of those questions to provide a background on the US operational approach of persistent engagement, the strategy of defend forward, where it came from and what we're learning from that. So a little bit of background. I was asked to sort of comment on really some of the key elements shaping US cyber posture today. And I think I could, there's lots of them, but if I was to sort of rank the three highest, the first is a series of changes that occurred in 2018, pivotal year for the US and for the Department of Defense. We had the emergence of a new strategy, Defend Forward, and a new Cyber Command vision of persistent engagement. We had a series of legal changes by our Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act, which said that cyber operations were a traditional military activity, no longer falling under covert activities, and a new presidential policy that delegated more authority to the Department of Defense to engage in cyberspace operations. So these were all kind of the enabling groundwork. And what proceeded from there, I think the second key element was a more active posture from 2018 forward, really tied initially to election security. And we gained a lot of insights from operating, okay? One of the things that we learned is that competition below the threshold of armed conflict and in through cyberspace is going to be continuous. It is going to be ongoing, and it's going to have cumulative strategic impact over time. However, we can disrupt this without escalation to crisis and armed conflict. And we began to learn those lessons in the Russia small group that was stood up at US Cyber Command of the National Security Agency to engage in whole of government election security efforts. And so learning about how to coordinate with the interagency, learning new ideas like Hunt Forward, and also the power of collaboration with industry. So from 2018 afterwards, we really began to understand more what I would call the competition space. The third really key element shaping the posture today is the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the insights that we're learning about the role of cyberspace operations in crisis and conflict. And key above those, among those, I think, is that the ability to be successful in a contingency requires you to begin before that. It requires you to be working with your partners in competition to anticipate how you can structure the crisis and conflict space to your advantage and to the advantage of your allies and partners. So those are kind of three of the 2018 pivotal turning point, lessons learned operating after that, and then how we're adapting to the experience of Russia-Ukraine. Persistent engagement and defend forward we've seen in action through this period of time. And I just want to talk a little bit about what it is and what it's not, and to dispel some misconceptions about it. It is an operational approach that comprises a set of principles and operating concepts that guide how we employ our military cyber forces in competition, in crisis, and in conflict. Okay, so it's an operational approach, and it emphasizes competing with adversaries now and continuously and proactively, which were comments that our host mentioned in the opening about this notion of trying to be proactive, trying to be anticipatory. A large part of it is about enabling partners, domestic partners and foreign partners, and also acting in and through cyberspace to try to get ahead of what the adversary is doing. We talk about seizing and maintaining the initiative, trying to understand your vulnerabilities, anticipate how they're going to be exploited, and then to inoculate your systems before the adversary weaponizes and exploits your vulnerabilities. So the idea here is not to be in a reactive mode where you're waiting and you absorb the attack, and then you're left cleaning up and responding. So that's really kind of the kernel of it. It's really an orientation about how to think about operating in this environment of continuous engagement and action. The other thing that it did was it really broadened the aperture of how we think about cyberspace activities beyond wartime planning. Certainly, all nation states need to be concerned with how they use the full range of their capabilities in both peace and in war. But what we began to see is that we needed to address what we saw as cumulative strategic loss that was being imposed by ongoing campaigns of our major adversaries. Those activities never rose to the level of armed conflict, never led to a response, and yet when you look at the impact on intellectual property theft, on military R&D and research theft, as well as the attacks on our democratic institutions, these were economic, military, and social costs that we were experiencing. So, that was really kind of the problem that didn't have a solution. And the existing approaches we were using really weren't dealing with that below the threshold of armed conflict behavior, which is the majority of cyberspace malicious activity that we see. Let me dispel a few misconceptions, okay? Persistent engagement is not just about disruption. Okay, there is a whole element of it that is a cooperative, enabling, anticipating, gaining insight, sharing insights. So it is not simply offensive. Being active does not mean you're being aggressive. It doesn't mean you're being assertive. It means that you're trying to gain the initiative so you can be better prepared and your systems can be more resilient before they're attacked. I think the flaw is assuming that any action that's not a response is somehow offensive, which it's not. Okay, much of what we do is defensive. It's enabling, as I said, to get anticipatory, sharing insights with our partners, with the private sector, with the interagency, really defending forward in time, if you think about it temporally. I think the other flaw is assuming that action undermines stability. And what I would really argue is that what's destabilizing is restraint in the face of continuous aggression. Okay, that creates what I would call de facto norms, all right, normal behavior. The prevalent behavior we are seeing has been normalized, and in ways that I think many of us, would find, less than desirable. And the final misperception are the fears of escalation, which I had mentioned, and what we have seen is that cyberspace activity and competition has not escalated to crisis and armed conflict. So I just want to sort of set the stage there to have a little bit more of a fulsome understanding of what this is. It has, in terms of the internalization of it, there have been conceptual challenges in terms of, people understanding this different orientation and becoming comfortable with it. I think there's also bureaucratic challenges, at least within our government. We tend to segment our roles and responsibilities and authorities across a range of different governmental institutions. And that creates a burden to really have to bridge those stovepipes, right? I don't think we would want it any other way, but nevertheless, we have adversaries that don't face those same sorts of constraints. And it makes it hard to be agile and to operate swiftly when you have that kind of a bureaucratic structure. So we work to really address a lot of that every day. I think what I would close with is just a recognition that defend forward and persistent engagement, defend forward being the DoD strategy and persistent engagement, the operational approach for implementing that, are not cure-alls. Okay, and no one is saying they are. They're components, I think, of a overdue shift, a long overdue shift to a more proactive, defensive, and competitive security posture in cyberspace. As such, they must be applied in concert with other strategic efforts to outcompete our adversaries and to posture ourselves together for potential crisis and armed conflict. Doing this, proactively looking for and identifying and contesting threats requires trust and common understandings within and across and among governments, societies, and states. Countries have different approaches. They have different domestic, political, and legal systems, different visions of sovereignty, and allies and partners need to be sensitive to those differences, but also need to work toward a shared perception of the threat. And I think we're making progress in terms of what I would call a whole of nation plus approach, the plus being with our foreign partners. I think our Hunt Forward operations, which we've had about 20 countries we deployed to since 2018, have been very fruitful in terms of identifying malicious activity and helping our partners to inoculate their systems. We have a very rich engagement with the private sector and have learned a lot about bi-directional sharing between government and industry. And I think that there's a shared understanding about the need to be proactive. And I think as well with our coalition partners, we're building trust, improving our ability to share intelligence, sharing ideas and sharing understandings about the environment that we face, and really working, I think, just to close, when we think about our coalition partners, working to make sure we all have secure networks for intelligence sharing so that we can achieve the collaborative partnerships that our host described as what they would like to see in the future. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldman, for such a very insightful presentation. And really, just going through your presentation about dispelling some of the misconceptions about the persistent engagement. And it's about this operational concept about being agile, anticipatory, and really thinking about applying it, implementing persistent engagement in concert to all strategic efforts. And you've also mentioned that action, the lack of action really undermines stability. And I think you pointed out this longstanding issue about establishing trust and common understanding among allies and partners, and really building that coalition, not just among nation states, but also the private sector, who we've mentioned at the opening remarks, really has a full grasp and full visibility of specifically critical national infrastructure. And I think just to share, at the beginning of the webinar, we had a survey that asks, what is the current main driver of cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities? And we had these results. The first one is cybercrime, ransomware, and cryptocurrency scams at 60%. Close to that is cyber warfare due to geopolitical competition at 53%, and weak public-private partnerships cooperation at 33%. And last is inadequate cybersecurity spending at 20%. Interesting results, and we'll see how these changes as we go along into our discussion. And Dr. Goldman, again, thank you for kicking us off and really ending with that note about coalition building, about whole of nation plus approach that includes allies and partners, as we turn to our Japanese colleague to talk about the Japanese perspective on US-Japan cyber cooperation. Our second panelist is Dr. Koichiro Komiyama. Dr. Komiyama is a senior researcher at the Keio Research Institute at Japan with an interest in norms in cyberspace, confidence building, and capacity building for cybersecurity. He is also the director of the Global Coordination Division at JP CERT CC, the Japanese Computer Emergency Response Team. He has worked as a security analyst, led security information collection, and published advisory alerts. He has also served as a member of the board of directors of FIRST, the Global Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams, and worked for the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, a multi-stakeholder forum that aims to enhance international security and stability. Komiyama-san, it's great to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Koichiro Komiyama. I'm a senior researcher with Keio University Research Institute at SFC. following international relations, especially cyber policy in the East Asia. I'm also a cybersecurity engineer by training. I have been with Japanese computer incident response team for many years. But today I'm participating this panel by my own capacity, and my comments are pretty much my own. And this morning I'd like to share with you three things: Japan's threat landscape and our new national security strategy, and finally the potential issues to implement the key concept, active cyber defense, which is defined or introduced by the new strategy. Sorry for my crappy voice. I tested positive for coronavirus last weekend. I'm feeling very well by now, but only my voice is still in bad shape. I usually sound like George Clooney, but I'm sorry for that. So let me start from Japan's threat landscape. In terms of security issues in general, interest in Russia's aggression against Ukraine is still high. For Japan, it was an opportunity to review our economic cooperation with Russia and deepen cooperation with NATO and allies. Secretary General of NATO recently visited Japan, and I heard his speech. He stressed that NATO and Japan may be oceans apart, but our security is closely connected. And that left a very strong impression on me. He's right by saying our security is closely connected. And that is partly because we are all connected by cyberspace or internet. And looking back at the war in Ukraine, a satellite communication system was cyber attacked. A cellular mobile carrier was assaulted by Russian forces, and a cruise missile was launched at Ukraine's data center. So the war in Ukraine demonstrates the very fine line between cyber operation and kinetic one. What we were worrying about? 2021 cyber strategy expressed a sense of urgency about the expansion of offensive cyber capability of China, Russia, and North Korea. Government of Japan in previous strategy document has not shown such explicit, such brand caution to specific countries. Many experts believe that in terms of quality and quantity, cyber attacks from China to Japan greatly exceeded those from other countries. North Korean cyber attacks are difficult to mitigate because the source or operators are distributed around the world. A small group of cyber guerrillas preparing ransomware attacks, and Japan is home to many crypto business players. So we have many cryptocurrency exchange, cryptocurrency businesses, and others. So we need further efforts to prevent it. And in addition, for us, effort must be made to prevent the direct financial damages to Japanese business. And to do that, I think we need to work with financial authority. So these are what we are worrying about right now, and move on to the new strategy. Crystal in the beginning already mentioned our new our new strategies. So December last year, we have a new national security strategy, new national defense program guideline, new midterm defense force development program. So these are the what we call three-piece combo for national security policies, and there will be many policy changes along with this amendment. And I'd like to share with you the potential changes in cyber area. One major objective is to acquire active cyber defense capability, and This will be explained in more detail later, but the goal is basically to acquire the ability to neutralize the cyber attack capability of our adversaries. National Center of Instant Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity, we call them NISC, or National Cybersecurity Center, is set to be reorganized. NISC has been the quarterback of Japan's cybersecurity policy, ruling and harmonize all the different policy of individual agencies for 20 years. But with new strategy, I guess we have replacement to current National Cybersecurity Center, and we are pretty much in the process of design new organization. But I can sense that with this new strategy, the National Police Agency and Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force, they will have larger stake in the new organization. We also have other things planned, includes, for example, introduction of security clearance system. Not sure it is pretty much like it is similar to what you have right now in United States. Create a cyber school in ground self-defense force. Launch of new organization to counter disinformation. So as a scholar, I really welcome the new defense policy, a new strategy, and there will be lots of changes, basically improvement for in this area. And finally, I'd like to move on to the what will be our challenge to implement the concept of active cyber defense. I think this is going to be a very, very difficult road. It is because 3 strategic documents that introduce or define active cyber defense, well, they were all agreed and approved by our cabinet. They are not law or legislation that were passed after discussion in our parliament. So what kind of capability, so the clear definition of active cyber defense and how we can implement those will be tabled in our parliament right now and maybe for next few months. And it will be gradually clarified through discussion among politicians and leaderships. But I can certainly anticipate few legal challenges and few operational challenges. So I'd like to share with you. First of all, for legal challenge, while listening to Emily's presentation, I think defend forward policy or US capability is really backed up the authority or capability of the Defense Department and military. It is not clear if self-defense force and military of defense will be the only player to realize the active cyber defense. What I mean is whether active cyber operation should be considered part of domestic law enforcement, whether it is considered as part of intelligence activity, whether it is considered as exercise of the right to self-defense, is not determined yet. And there's a possibility that we do something similar to what US military is doing right now in the area of, or in the course of domestic law enforcement. So depending on the 3 choices, ministry in charge, law it affects, and its budget will significantly change. Due to the limitation or limitation and self-defense force operation, I guess National Police Agency will be the one of major key player to even in implementing active cyber defense operation. And of course, it must be consistent with existing domestic law and constitutions. Japan's constitution contains provision for protection of secrecy of communication, protection of privacy, and others. So therefore, technically, it is very difficult for government of Japan to obtain similar capability on our end. So that's a potential legal challenges. And we have many operational challenges, but let me just introduce one. In my opinion, Japan's cybersecurity technology is not bad. We are probably one of the top 10 in the world in terms of the technical excellence and others. If there's a world ranking, so we have at least competent technologies. Here, however, advanced technology or technologies is only a mean to an operational goal. I'd like to share with you my own experience. In my analysis of cyber attack, I saw example of I saw malwares, attackers using very sophisticated, unique file compression algorithm, or attackers using a very unique high-tech encryption technology to keep their operational security, make it difficult for us to follow who they are. But those choices using very sophisticated and unique technology to launch a cyber attack might be technically the right choice. But once it's discovered and analyzed, it becomes difficult to deny one's own involvement. In other words, the more you write excellent code, the more you risk yourself by losing plausible deniability. So operationally, best choice might be not writing code by yourself, trying to purchase or copy and paste any available code on internet forum. So again, Japan may have competent technology, but we are far from experienced in this area. We don't have much experience in intelligence operation and at least the offensive cyber operation. So I think that's the area we need support from allies very much. Yep, so I'd like to stop here. Over to you, Mark, and looking forward to further discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Komiyama-san. And also, I'd like to mention that Komiyama-san has also been our cyber advisor during our very first US-Japan cyber cooperation beyond the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And he was actually the Japan shepherd during our tabletop exercise. And we really do appreciate your participation here, despite being in your current health condition. And we wish you full recovery. And it seems like with your presentation, it seems like you're doing really well. So again, thank you so much for that. And just to recap, there's just so many insights to cover and really unpack from what you've shared. And I think we had this discussion before that oftentimes the challenges in understanding or deciphering Japan's defense and security policy and also in cybersecurity is really the lack of availability of English or Japanese documents translated into English. And so we really appreciate your inside information on all these new developments. And I would just like really to point out very quickly this important point about the legal and operational challenges that Japan faces in terms of the active cyber defense. And there has been a lot of buzz and hype about the active cyber defense. And you've rightly pointed out all the sort of the limitations that the concept really is in terms of the pacifist constitution in Japan, and also in terms of the technical challenges and the need for greater coordination, or at least support or capacity building between Japan and the US in terms of intelligence sharing. And I think that is a perfect segue to our final speaker for today, because it's never a complete picture of the cybersecurity landscape without a voice from the private sector. And we are very pleased to have Mr. Michael Karimian, the Director of Digital Diplomacy Asia Pacific at Microsoft. Michael works with governments, civil society, and the private sector across the region to advance greater multi-stakeholder engagement and support governments in recognizing and strengthening rule-based order online in the face of cybercrime. Michael was previously a director on Microsoft's human rights team and worked in trade finance at the Royal Bank of Scotland in London, and in business and human rights at the United Nations in Bangkok. Today, Michael focuses on multi-stakeholder diplomacy, capacity building, confidence building, data, and research. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the very kind introduction there as well. Thank you, of course, to the Pacific Forum for including me in today's session. Of course, the person from Microsoft has to use some PowerPoint slides, so if you don't mind whilst I just bring them up. There we go. Hopefully you should be able to see everything in a moment. Just go to presentation mode. There we go. Okay, so in terms of the remarks that Mark asked me to deliver, he asked me to focus on the threat landscape that's facing the region, including the US and Japan, and the sort of trends that Microsoft is seeing across the board. Everything I will talk through is available in the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, which is freely available at microsoft.com/MDDR. So please do feel free to take a look when you want to. It goes without saying that Microsoft serves billions of customers globally, and that really allows the company to aggregate security data from a broad range of organizations and consumers around the world. That data is captured and analyzed in the Digital Defense Report, which draws on the company's breadth and depths of signals intelligence from across the Microsoft ecosystem, including in the cloud. And I think it's fair to say that gives the company a unique vantage point, or a sort of high fidelity picture of the threat landscape of cybersecurity, including indicators that will help us to predict what attackers will do next. And the aim for this report is really twofold. One is to illuminate the evolving digital threat landscape for customers, partners, and stakeholders, and really to shine a light on both the new cyber attacks and evolving trends that we see out there, but also quite importantly to empower Microsoft's customers and partners to improve their own cyber resiliency and respond to those threats. In terms of the advanced persistent threats that Microsoft sees, it's fair to say that nation states present some of the most advanced and persistent threats that our customers face. And those threats include, but are not limited to, intellectual property theft, as well as espionage and surveillance, credential theft, destructive attacks, and much, much more. Now, Microsoft invests significant resources into discovering, understanding, and countering nation-state threats. And actually, when an organization or individual account holder is targeted or compromised by an observed nation-state activity, Microsoft will deliver an alert in the form of what's called a nation-state notification, or an NSN for short. And that NSN is sent directly to the customer and includes information that they can use to remedy and investigate the activity. As of June last year, Microsoft has delivered over 67,000 nation-state notifications since 2018. So in approximately 4-year period, over 67,000 nation-state activities have been identified and communicated to customers. Now, which I hope gives some sort of sense of the scale of the problem that Microsoft sees. This map that I'm showing on the screen at the moment shows a sample of some of the nation-state actors that we track. Unsurprisingly, the 4 primary nation-state groups where we see activity stemming from are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, but we're also seeing an increased amount of activity coming from Lebanon. Microsoft actually identifies nation-state groups by chemical element names. That's just so for our own taxonomy purposes. And as I mentioned throughout the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, there's a much deeper view into attack targets, techniques, and analysis of the motivations, although I'll run through some of that in these slides now. It's fair to say, though, that although many of these groups use the same tools as cyber criminals, they actually present quite unique threats in the form of bespoke malware, as well as the ability to discover and capitalize on zero-day vulnerabilities. And of course, importantly, they actually benefit from having legal immunity in many cases. If we turn to the evolving nation-state threats, political developments over the last year really shaped what we see as the priorities and risk tolerance of the state-sponsored threat groups worldwide. Mainly because as geopolitical relationships have broken down, we see that cyber actors have become much more brazen and aggressive. So, for example, Russia is relentlessly targeting the Ukrainian government and the country's critical infrastructure in order to complement its on-the-ground military activity. Iran has been aggressively seeking inroads into US critical infrastructure, such as port authorities. North Korea is continuing its campaign of stealing cryptocurrency from financial and technology companies, just as Koichiro was discussing, and China has been expanding its efforts towards global cyber espionage operations. In the past year, quite importantly, though, supply chain attacks have also increased, and there's been a particular focus on IT service providers, because in this way, threat actors are often able to reach their original target through the trusted relationship that that target has with its IT supply chain. So in these examples, IT service providers are quite attractive sort of intermediary targets, because they serve hundreds of direct and thousands of indirect clients in the interests of foreign intelligence services. And of course, if exploited, this routine business practice might allow malicious actors to access and manipulate IT service provider client networks without actually triggering any alerts. In terms of nation-state groups targeting critical infrastructure, that really increased in the past year. As you can see in the graph on the bottom right corner, we really see actors focusing on companies in the IT sector, as well as financial services, transportation systems, and communications infrastructure. In terms of where those targeted groups are located, we're seeing nation-state groups cyber targeting really spanned the globe in the last year, but actually there is a particularly heavy focus on US and UK enterprises, but also a lot of activity targeting organizations in Israel, the UAE, Canada, Germany, India, Switzerland, and Japan. They were among some of the most frequently targeted countries according to our nation-state notifications. If we look specifically at Japan, with regards to Russia, activity is limited from our vantage point, but focused on foreign affairs, with some targeting of financial and manufacturing firms. The Russian threat actor group Nobelium is the most engaged, but actually we're also seeing, of course, a lot of activity from the pro-Russia cybercrime group known as Killnet, which conducted a DDoS attack against transportation and government websites in response to what it calls Japan's so-called anti-Russia campaign. In terms of China, again, limited activity that Microsoft observed, but there were two manufacturers who were compromised by two different groups. And of course, manufacturing is a sector that has been a high value target for economic espionage operations. Turning to North Korea, diplomatic, media, think tank, and academic institutions are often the targets for geopolitical, defense, and industrial espionage from North Korea. We also see really the continued use of social media platforms. Actually, that includes LinkedIn, whereby North Korean actors are sending so-called lures and spear phishing attempts at individual accounts. And in terms of active groups, we see Thallium and Copernicum are the most active groups coming from North Korea, targeting Japanese government and media. I'll quickly mention cyber influence operations targeting Japan. And obviously, Russian-Japanese relations have worsened following the invasion of Ukraine. And what we now see is that propaganda and influence operations may increase due to the sanctions brought against Russia by Japan. Russian propaganda in general has often targeted Japan with a pro-Kremlin slant on a number of strategic interests, mainly with regards to the Kuril Islands dispute. If we think about China and cyber influence operations from China, the effectiveness of China's influence in Japanese society and media is actually quite limited due to the historical tensions between the two countries. And actually that's helped to foster a sense of resilience within the Japanese government and general population against Chinese cyber influence operations. However, as Japan's bilateral relations or dialogue with Taiwan has increased and led to a clearer intent to aid Taiwan if China invades, that could trigger additional influence operations from China. Turning to look at globally the nation-state activities and trends that we're seeing at the big picture, we really do see China expand in its global targeting, especially against smaller nations in Southeast Asia. And the purpose of that is to gain intelligence and competitive advantage. Iran is really becoming much more aggressive, and that's particularly following the power transition into Iran. So we see much more ransomware attacks coming from Iran. And of course, the targeting, as I mentioned, of US critical infrastructure. As I mentioned, North Korea is targeting defense and aerospace companies, as well as cryptocurrency, but also news outlets, defectors, and others. And of course, that's for the strategic goal of building the country's economy in order to ensure stability. I'll lastly mention the category mentioned in the bottom right, cyber mercenary activity. Of course, these private sector offensive actors really do threaten the stability of cyberspace because they are selling advanced tools, techniques, and services to clients who otherwise couldn't develop those techniques themselves. And so that does increase the marketplace for governments who are able to conduct these operations so that smaller, less advanced governments are able to engage in these types of activities. There is, of course, the related but slightly separate subject matter of cybercrime, which we should look at. So in terms of general trends, overall, we're seeing that cybercrime is continuing to rise, and there's certainly an increase in both random and targeted attacks. And that's particularly true as the industrialization of the cybercrime economy helps to lower the skills barrier to entry, since there is this greater access of tools and services, as I was just mentioning. Also, in addition, what we're actually seeing is that attackers are adapting and finding new ways to implement their techniques. And that's obviously increasing the complexity of how and where they host their campaign operation infrastructure. In terms of ransomware, the threats of ransomware and extortion is just becoming much more audacious. We see attacks against governments, businesses, and critical infrastructure, and attackers are increasingly threatening to disclose sensitive information in order to force ransom payments. Quite importantly, human-operated ransomware is most prevalent because actually 1/3 of targets are successfully compromised using this approach, and 5% of those are ransomed, which 5% on its own might not seem like a large number, but of course the scale of ransomware means that 5% is highly, highly profitable. Of course, it's good to end on a bit of a positive note, so let's look at the importance of cyber resilience. Shown here is the cyber resilience bell curve. This bell curve is meant to convey the 5 actions which every organization should adopt for better resilience. Now, we show these actions in no particular order because really they should be taken together as the minimum standards. Because what we've seen is that many cyber attacks are quite successful simply because basic security hygiene has not been followed. So the minimum standards which every organization, frankly every individual, should adopt include enabling multi-factor authentication in order to better protect compromised user passwords and help provide an extra layer of resilience. Of course, it's important, as many of you will know in the audience, to apply zero trust principles. That's absolutely the cornerstone of any resilience plan to limit the impact on an organization. It's important to use extended detection and response anti-malware because implementing this software to detect and automatically block attacks is essential and will provide insights to the security operations. Relatedly, monitoring insights from threat detection systems also helps to respond to the threats in a very timely fashion. And also, of course, it's important to keep up to date because what we see is that unpatched and out-of-date systems are a key reason many organizations fall victim to an attack. And so updates should be applied to firmware, operating systems, and applications. And of course, it's important to protect data because knowing where your data is located and whether the right systems are implemented is important to implementing the appropriate protection. And it sort of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. All of this can be done much better in the cloud. I'm not a salesperson, so I don't receive any commission by selling Microsoft products. But regardless, I think it's fair to say that whether an end user is using Microsoft's cloud, Google, Amazon, or elsewhere, all these cyber resilience techniques are much better achieved in the cloud rather than at an individual level. I do hope that was a useful overview of the threat landscape and the trends that we are seeing. I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A in a moment.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing the digital defense report and providing us a snapshot of what has been going on in the threat landscape, not just within the Indo-Pacific, but globally. And and understanding that cyberspace is really borderless and it really transcends any geographical location or demarcation. And again, thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts on U.S.-Japan cybersecurity defense cooperation. We will now invite our audience to ask questions to our panelists. So for our audience, we can ask, or you can ask that you can use the Q&A window or raise your hand in the webinar controls that is accessible from the participants tab. If you raise your hand to ask your question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute to give others a chance to ask questions. Please, we ask you to keep your questions brief and direct to the point. And also, please be ready to unmute yourself. And I think being the moderator for the session and the Masters of Ceremonies, I would definitely use my powers to ask question to each of our great speakers for today. I think I'd start with Dr. Goldman. After Dr. Goldman, after hearing Koichiro Komiyama's presentation on Japan's active cyber defense, what would be the sort of reaction, at least from Washington, D.C. or from the U.S. Cyber Command in terms of these development in Japan's cybersecurity posture with regard to the U.S. cybersecurity cooperation? To Koichiro Komiyama, you've mentioned, I think, a big aspect of the current policy landscape in Japan right now is the idea of economic security. And during Kishida-san's, Prime Minister Kishida's Shangri-La Dialogue speech, he mentioned economic security as this new policy area. I was just wondering if there is any sort of relationship, at least of the influence of economic security in Japan's national defense strategy, and also particularly on Japan's cybersecurity policy. And lastly, I think, Michael, my question to you is, our audience would be very interested. Has there been any changes in the war in Ukraine has been going on now for a year, and what has been some of the trends that you've seen changing, or at least some of the general observations that you had since the war erupted last year and up to the present point? Has there been any changes in terms of Russia's tactics, techniques, and procedures in terms of launching cyber offensive operations? And so I think we can start again with Dr. Goldman, and then we can go to Komiyama-san and then Michael.
I get to go first every time. Okay, so I guess the way I would answer your question is, simply to say that Japan is a tremendous ally of the United States in so many ways, and so we're always looking for ways to improve that collaboration and that understanding, and especially with events, projected events in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think that we look at our partners and they, as I said, different levels of capacity, different constraints that they have. And so part of that is really understanding what those are so that you can collectively work together to, address problems that may be, on the horizon or the ones that are here now. So that is really our approach with all of our allies and partners. I just am, kind of welcome the conversation about how Japan understands active cyber defense, and to have a clear understanding of how we in the United States think about persistent engagement. I think that sharing of ideas is an important element of the cooperation as well.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. Komiyama-san?
Thank you, Mark. And for sure, the economic security is one of major agenda for Kishida administration. I'm not very knowledgeable in how it affects to cyberspace or cybersecurity policy. One thing I can think of is though, in the cyberspace, of course, there's an area controlled by private sector or platformers like Microsoft. And then there's also area that closely tied with soil of Japan's, or closely tied to every single sovereign states. For example, data center must be, you cannot build a data center on cloud. You cannot have submarine cable and well, you have to run submarine cable to each state. And you know what? It was just 2 weeks ago. Matsu Island. There's a tiny island owned by government of Taiwan, but the small island is like 100 kilometers from Chinese East Coast. And this island was connected to mainland Taiwan by 2 submarine cables. And during the 5 days fishing boat from China, it's a innocent fisherman's, but that cut it to submarine cables, and Taiwan lost connection to its territory, and there's no plan or pipeline when they can fix that connection back to normal. You know what? Vietnam has been connected to, it's a big economy, and it has been connected to internet by using 5 different submarine cables. They lose cables one by one for last few months. Now they are relying on one single submarine cable, which is almost discontinued. It's a very tired old infrastructure. So if they lose this last cable, all the traffic must route from mainland China, or I don't know, maybe route to Laos, Cambodia. I don't know. So the cyberspace is relying on physical cables and infrastructures, and that's an area we should address. Thank you.
Thank you, Komiyama-san. Michael?
Sure thing. So in terms of Ukraine, the way in which we've seen that evolve in time, just taking a sort of big picture view, Russia has combined its cyber attacks and influence operations with its military operations, both as it launched and then continued its war in Ukraine. Even before Russia's invasion, Ukraine was on the receiving end of more cyber attacks each year than any other country after the United States. And those attacks were mostly emanating from Russia. Progressively, what we then began to see was that those cyber attacks would move from commercial customers to the government and the systems of organizations who work closely with the government. And the tactics and techniques include spear phishing, exploitation of IT services, supply chains, and exploitation of publicly facing applications. When the war began just over approximately a year ago, of course, there was initially a round of cyber attacks hours before the physical invasion began. We saw actors associated with the Russian military and intelligence launch multiple waves of destructive cyber attacks, which have continued throughout the war. The threat actors intended to destroy data and to impede the work of the Ukrainian government in initial stages, and again, has continued since. And what we've seen most recently are 2 evolutions in the past couple of months. One is as the winter began to roll in and more humanitarian aid was coming in from Ukraine's neighboring countries, there have been efforts to derail the transportation of military and humanitarian assistance from outside into Ukraine. So we see targeting of organizations in neighboring countries. But also, in addition to those destructive cyber attacks, we're also seeing cyber espionage and, of course, increasingly cyber influence operations as well, which is actually happening around the world to support Russia's efforts. And so both state and state-affiliated groups are using influence operations to help shape opinion. We see them targeting the Russian population with the goal of sustaining domestic support. We see them targeting the Ukrainian population with the goal of undermining the country's public support and willingness to withstand Russian attacks. And we also see targeting of American and European audiences with the goal of undermining Western unity and also to deflect criticism of war crimes. And we actually see a lot of activity in non-aligned countries as well, which is particularly worrying since in many non-aligned countries, Russian state-controlled media is the primary source of news for many, many people. And of course, this is a trend that will continue and should be quite worrying to government, industry, and civil society worldwide.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think we've been talking about cyber resilience and cyber defense in this forum, but I think disinformation and foreign interference keeps coming up, and I think Dr. Goldman also raised this notion of hunt forward, and a big part of Japan's national defense strategy and security strategy is also this move towards a disinformation campaign. So I would just like to throw it to Dr. Goldman before we go into the questions. We have so many questions in the chat box, but I just really want to tease out further this notion of this concept of disinformation and how it ties into this evolving cybersecurity landscape, because we're seeing a convergence of foreign interference, influence operations, or information warfare, and with cyber attacks or cyber operations. Dr. Goldman, if you could briefly share any learnings from Hunt Forward, working with allies and partners on the aspect of disinformation, or how did the U.S. government is able to at least put some countermeasures in that. And also to Komiyama-san, disinformation is becoming a huge problem as well in Japan, as Michael has greatly discussed. What do you think is in reality, in terms of policy or implementation, where is the Japanese government going towards countering disinformation? So we can start, ladies first, we can start with Dr. Goldman, and then we can go to Komiyama-san.
Yeah, so a few comments. Look, I think that we tend to sometimes separate like cyber from information, but it's all part of the global information environment, right? And, we talk about, cyber incidents or attacks, it's really about the connectivity, right? And then the information is about the content, right? So there's the connectivity, or you can go for the content. And ultimately, I think the goal there is to have a cognitive effect on a group of people or a population, right? And different states do it differently, right? Based on their capabilities, based on their histories. I mean, this is like, if you look back into the military history, different countries adopt new technologies in different ways based on a whole variety of things, right? So we should expect that other countries will, I'm looking at nation state actors, are going to do this differently. I think we see that the power, as Michael said, the power of information operations overlaid on cyber effects operations, that they really do together can have a much, a greater impact. In terms of the whole disinformation question is a really thorny one. And I think it's a really thorny one for democracies to see, to try to think about how do we, I kind of think of I'm going to sort of take it back, the big challenge between democracies and techno-authoritarian regimes is between information freedom and information control, right? And really, we have a vision of thinking that more information is better, and it may not be the perfect information, but we're all better off if there's more than rather there's this information control. So I think we have, really together, our countries need to sit and to have this conversation, as opposed to just throwing these words around like this is disinformation. I mean, in my view, it's a really challenging thing for democratic states. So I'll just leave it there.
Komiyama-san, any thoughts about Japanese policy and disinformation with respect to the new national defense strategy, with the national security strategy? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I published a book on disinformation January. If you read Japanese, yeah, please buy my book. And it's an old issue that has been talked about for years. And it's an old issue because, for example, in the 1930s, before World War II, Hitler and Nazi used radio. They developed inexpensive radios that reached 70% of German population or households. They broadcast Hitler's speeches. Without radio, Nazi propaganda could not be very impactful as it was. And Nazi, it would have been impossible for them to come to power. Now, this information in cyberspace, it's difficult to prevent it while maintaining democracy. The more we eliminate this information from cyberspace, the more we mimic the act of authoritarian states. And I think as a democracy, we must overcome the temptation to make for example, make the Ministry of Truth that appeared in George Orwell's famous novel 1984, and we must resist to the temptation to create a fully controlled world in which a handful of elites provide information to dumb publics in one direction, and that requires tolerance that there will be some degree of disorder in cyberspace. But overall, I think we are doing great in combating against disinformation, because newspaper, radio, television has killed countless number of people. In contrast, disinformation in cyberspace caused relatively minor effects so far. So the worst is yet to come.
Thank you, Komiyama-san. And now we turn to the questions that our audience posed through our Q&A chat box. We begin with Jun Park. She asks, what would be the core objective of the US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation? To combat illicit acquisition of information via cyber espionage, cryptocurrency theft, or both? And cyber operations from which country would be the main target for the enhancement of US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation? Dr. Goldman, would you want to answer the question, and we can go to Komiyama-san with the Japan perspective?
So if I understand the question is what would be the main focus of a cyber? Okay, I'm going to take it to the other side and say it's going to be, potential warfare in the Indo-Pacific with China. I mean, I think that the question becomes, the need to have, secure networks and systems with your allies and your partners that are able to share information, so that, that in case of that scenario, that's something that you can have this ongoing collaboration and cooperation with. So I think there's a lot of different levels of, having collective cyber resilience, because, we're all on the same internet, right? We're all basically in this same kind of, interconnected space. So what's going to affect one country can easily affect another. But if I'm going to sort of think of a hierarchy from my vantage point, it's looking at, the need to cooperate in case of that type of a scenario. So I know that wasn't one of the choices, but I'm going to add that to the poll, right?
Komiyama-san, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you for this question. I guess I don't understand what he or she asked me for. Was this question free? But as US-Japan cooperation is one of the foundation of overall Japanese security strategy and policy, we are relying on, Japan is relying on many things with US, and I think it's I hope it's really a mutual assistance by two countries in different end of Pacific Ocean. And this is a difficult question, because there are and there will be so many cooperation among US and Japan, and I cannot name any specific area which I can focusing on. But for cryptocurrency one, I think US made a clever choice that introduced the using financial sanction scheme and make it illegal for victim company or victim organization to pay ransom money to a criminal group. And research revealed that I'm pretty sure this decision was painful for certain victims of cyber attack. However, after a year or 2 years, overall, the whole payment, whole ransom money payment was decreased by like 50%. So this was a very successful decision by U.S. financial authorities, and I really hope Japan to follow that situation.
Thank you so much. We do have a question from Deborah Decker from Stimson, and I think this question is directed to Michael, and I think some of the other panelists as well could weigh in on this issue of attribution. So I think Deborah's question is, when you attribute an incident to a state actor, how do you determine the level of confidence you have in your statements? The initial Ukraine Trojan horse wiper malware to us civilians, did not appear that sophisticated. Given the prevalence of some malware and vulnerabilities and the emergence of attacks as a service, what characteristics of an incident mark it as a government-initiated attack or a state-sponsored attack government-initiated attack rather than a state-based threat? You said attackers associated with the military in the Ukraine case, but attackers can disguise themselves. With the Russian military not attempting to disguise itself, many in the world, including Ukraine, didn't believe in the US government warning of an emerging Russian offensive. So I think the question really is about what is the determining factor that provides that level of confidence when we attribute certain cyber attacks. And Michael, if you would like to weigh in on this issue, also I yield the question as well to Emily and Komiyama-san if they have thoughts about this. I think this is a general question on attribution, but adding that sort of layer of what characteristics of an incident mark it as a government-initiated attack rather than a state-based threat. So any thoughts from? Let's start with Michael, and then if Dr. Goldman and Komiyama-san would like to add anything, feel free to do so. Michael?
Sure thing. So it's a great question, and actually reminds me of one of the poll questions where the answer was impose mandatory incident reporting. I initially reread that as improve, and actually I think improve should have been the category rather than impose. But yeah, you're right that there is a challenge with attribution. One is that publicly available standards for attributing attacks is it's inconsistent. But at Microsoft, really, there's a lot of effort underway to make sure that we have consistent frameworks which can use different categories of evidence, which sort of fit into categories of technical, behavioral, and contextual. That's sort of the different categories of evidence that we have. And of course, that can come from open source data as well as the telemetry data that Microsoft has access to. From that, we're able to come to an assessment where we can talk about having a low confidence, moderate confidence, or high confidence. So obviously, it's important to sort of categorize the level of confidence that we have. But of course, some judgments could be incomplete in nature, depending on the amount of information and proof that we have at hand. There's another part in Deborah's question, which I want to pick up on, the wording about attackers associated with. So, groups can sort of be categorized into three different buckets. One is you have threat actors who sit within government agencies, so it could be within intelligence services, ministries of defense, for example, or specialized cybersecurity agencies. Those are funded and directed directly under the direction of the government. You then have groups who are associated with the government. So they might sit outside the government, but nevertheless, they may receive some funding or direction from the government. And then you have groups which are neither receive funding nor direction from the government, but they might be aligned with government strategic goals and directions. And so they operate in a similar direction anyway. So that's where you get these sort of similar levels, these different categories of threat actors out there.
Dr. Goldman?
Yeah, so I think I would, just to add to that, to also point out that there are kind of different, not like levels of attribution, but there's the technical attribution, which Michael talked about, and that's critically important. There's also political attribution. So that's a higher level of confidence if a government wants to publicly attribute. Okay, often you'll see a private sector entity might attribute. The question is, does a government attribute? And I think a lot of other calculations go into that. And then you have a level of, our states have talked about collective attribution. Okay, so you may want to collectively with your allies and partners attribute, and there you have a question where some states will say, well, we want to be able for our security services to see the evidence and to evaluated ourselves. We don't want to take the word of another country. And then above that, you have law enforcement attribution, right? So there, if you're going to go to a court of law, you need a much higher standard to do that. So there's also that, it's kind of like a matrix, but that's also different thought processes that go into how governments do their attribution.
Komiyama-san?
Yeah, let me add. I have not involved in any process of political or attribution at the law enforcement. However, I could say sometimes the political attribution is purposely vague or ambiguous. Government of Japan published the attribution for APT group, and that statement says we are confident that attack was conducted by group based in China, and by saying that they refrain from accusing government or Communist Party of China directly, and that's really a political decision which beyond my understanding and control. And I'd like to mention one other thing is the war in Ukraine. We learned that how private sector is powerful in getting in situational awareness and others. We were totally relying on reports from Microsoft, information from Google and Amazon. So it's great unless we have, nice guy like Michael working for Microsoft. He has been, and he will be very cooperative to us. But Michael can be friend for next 30 years with Japan. And there's no guarantee for that. Country like Japan or others is really determining or need to determine if we can, blindly rely on or trust any big tech. And it may be time to, at least try create something by ourselves. I know it's really difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Komiyama-san, Dr. Goldman, and also Michael, for your fantastic contribution to today's discussion. And before we get to the closing of the program, we just wanted to run again our poll, just to see if there has been a change in perception or behavior among our audience from the very beginning of the webinar up to this point where we had this great exchange of ideas and deliberations. So the question again is, what is the current main driver of cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities? Cyber warfare due to geopolitical competition, cybercrime, ransomware, and cryptocurrency scams, inadequate cybersecurity spending, or weak public-private partnerships or cooperation. We ask our audience to please key in your votes. As we wait for that, again, we do have a post-event survey form in our chat box, and would encourage all our participants to please accomplish the survey form for us to incorporate your feedback and improve our programming in the succeeding sessions of the forum. So following the discussion today, there has been a rapid shift where most of the participants answered cyber warfare due to geopolitical competition. A while back, I think it was really cybercrime, ransomware, and cryptocurrency scams who really had the biggest share, at least lead in terms of the percentage. So let's go to the second poll question that we did today. Please. How can the government and the private sector improve trust and transparency on information sharing, provide incentives, encourage self-regulation, reduce fines or penalties, conduct regular roundtables or meetings, impose, or as Michael suggested, improve mandatory incident reporting? So again, please key in our audience response to the poll question. So it's conducting regular roundtables or meetings at 55%, followed by imposed mandatory incident reporting. And still, the last would be the encouragement of self-regulation. So polls and changes of perception and attitudes among our audience. And again, thank you for those responses. Thank you to all our audience, for our participants for sending in those questions. On behalf of Pacific Forum, we would like to thank our panelists, Dr. Emily Goldman, Dr. Koichiro Komiyama, and Michael Karimian. And we would like to encourage again all our participants to please answer the post-event survey form. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We'd also like to express again our appreciation to the U.S. Embassy Tokyo and the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, or RCAS, at the University of Tokyo for making this event possible. Again, we would really appreciate if you could answer the post-event survey form, and we hope you all continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find more about our future activities on our website at pacforum.org. Our next US-Japan Cyber Forum webinar will be on cyber diplomacy in March 29 US time and March 30 in Japan, Asia. I am Mark Manantan, Director of Cybersecurity and Critical Technologies at the Pacific Forum. Thank you all for joining, and mahalo, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.